Hi, welcome back to Podcast 5. We're going to begin with Jean Harlow, and Susan will talk a little bit about her if you've never heard of her, and Clark Gable. So, Susan, take it away.
Yes, Jean Harlow was very, very, very special to Clark Gable for many reasons. They were both close in age. Well, actually, she was 10 years younger. He was born in 1901. She was born in 1911, also the same age as Ginger Rogers and Ronald Reagan, the future president. But she was so special and so sweet. She was from Missouri, and you would never know it if you see her on the screen. She came from a very wealthy family, but Jean Harlow sounded like she was from Brooklyn. How she did that, I don't know. But she was charming, and Howard Hughes put her in Wings famously, but she was terrible in that. So he said, well, maybe you should do comedy, and that was her forte. Watch her in Red Dust, and there's a fabulous movie without Gable, but Red-Headed Woman, and also Blonde Bombshell. Harlow is fabulous, and she's very special and very sad. She had died. I'll talk about that in a moment. But her and Gable met at MGM. She was in MGM too, very young, just starting out. And they were in a movie called The Secret Six, which was one of the ones he did not like. He made a movie called The Secret Six. He made another one called The Finger Points. And these were gangster movies. And he didn't like those. But they became friendly during The Secret Six. They made 6 films together. Very importantly, they made a wonderful film called Hold Your Man that I just love. But my favorite of all their films, of course, is Red Dust, and I spoke about that before. But while they were making Red Dust, Harlow was married to a much older man named Paul Byrne, and he committed suicide. And there was a lot of backstory. They had to cover up a lot of things, but Gable was there for her when she came back to the set. I'll talk more about Paul Byrne later because he figures too. He was a producer at MGM, very wealthy, and he was very kind, but he had some problems, and we'll talk about all that later. But Gable loved her, and as I said, they never had a romantic relationship, and he did with most of his leading ladies. I must say Clark Gable was a rounder, but I will say that. But Clark Gable called her sis, or they called her the baby, but he always called her sis. And she was known as the Platinum Blonde. She had white hair, basically way beyond blonde, and she was very, very gorgeous. She had curves that just would not quit, and she was only 26 when she died, which was very sad. And actually, they were making a film when she died called Saratoga, and they were both so huge that when they made Saratoga, Gable and her, by that time, would love to do their pictures together. They had to go for Harrell. He was the famous George Harrell, the photographer for MGM, and did all the glamorous, if you see all the glamorous shots of old Hollywood, Harrell did most of them. But they hated doing those basically, but they loved doing them together, and they would say, let's heat up the screen. And they would do all these wonderful poses. And she called him the Ohio Hillbilly, and he called her the Chromium Blonde. They teased each other. But during Saratoga, she became deathly ill, and of course there was no way she could be saved. Her kidneys were failing, and at that time there were only 3 things you could do. A kidney transplant, which was decades off. There was not even antibiotics at that time. They didn't come about until World War II for the men in the service. And also, you could have dialysis. There was no dialysis back then. But they were making Saratoga, and she had been ill for quite a while. She had her wisdom teeth out right before that. Well, they were filming, and Clark Gable had to pick her up in this scene, and he knew she was very ill. And she was like almost unconscious, and he waved to the cameraman to stop the film going. And they had to take her home, and Clark Gable visited her, and he told Carole Lombard later, it was like kissing a dead person. She had urine on her breath, her kidneys were failing. It was horrible, but Clark Gable and Carole Lombard, he was an usher at her funeral. They neither one wanted to go because he loved her so much. They were already dating at that time because this was in 1937 when she died. But Carole Lombard famously told Gable at that time they had gone to Thalberg's funeral, and he was the year before her, and that was 2 great losses to Gable in the 30s. He loved both of them, and they were very close to him. But she famously told him, I do not want a circus like this if I go first. And that will figure into when she died in a plane crash. We're going to talk a great deal about that later. But it was a real circus, and Jean Harlow left a very small estate because she was keeping her mother mother and her stepfather up, and she was just such a sweet person. Everybody just loved her. And at the time of her death, she was dating William Powell, famously of the Thin Man series. Now, he was a great deal older than her, because William Powell was born in about 1892, so he was close to 20 years older than her.
Can I ask about the Thin Man? Because there was a TV show in the 60s called The Thin Man with
Joanne Flug, I remember that.
Yes, but this is not the same. This was a spinoff of the movie.
It was a spinoff, yeah, because William Powell actually became a household name in the 30s. He was very successful at MGM, but Woody, there was a director that made Manhattan Melodrama, and I'm trying to think of his last name. It escapes me. I'm sorry. I can find that later. But
that's okay.
Manhattan Melodrama was a film with Myrna Loy, Clark Gable, and William Powell. Again, Gable played a gangster. Very big hit. But the director said he loved the way that Myrna Loy and William Powell played off each other. And he wanted to do The Thin Man, the first one. There were lots of Thin Man. There was The Thin Man Comes Home, The Thin Man Returns. I think they did 8 or 10 Thin Man series. They did 14 movies together.
Michael Renee, that was the Thin Man of the 60s, I think.
Yes, Michael Renee, yeah.
Renee, sorry.
And, and the thing is, he said they'll be great in it. Well, but they became huge, but they did other movies. And now I love the Thin Man series. But let me tell you and recommend highly, highly, highly a film called Libeled Lady, going back to our famous Harlow. It had a powerhouse of movie stars. It had Jean Harlow, Spencer Tracy, Myrna Loy, and William Powell. It's a screwball comedy.
What year, Susan?
It was in 1936, Libeled Lady, and it is one of the funniest movies. The first time I saw it was in a repertory theater here in Atlanta, and I was literally in the aisles, rolling down the aisles laughing. It is that funny. It's funnier than It Happened One Night. Although It Happened One Night is very funny, but it is just rollicking. But It Happened One Night is my favorite, but that's probably my next favorite. And they did several other movies that I like even better than The Thin Man. I love The Thin Man, but I love the other movies they did. There's one called It's Love I'm After that I also love. It's a screwball comedy. And that has, believe it or not, Olivia de Havilland, Leslie Howard, and Bette Davis. And it is hugely funny.
Olivia de Havilland, was this her first break in America, in the film?
No, she was in Gone with the Wind. Most of you will know her. She played Melanie in Gone with the Wind, but she was at Warner Brothers. She was very big with Errol Flynn. They made 8 films together, and he actually wanted to marry her, but this was when she was very young, and she actually brought up the famous line I was just telling you about the last podcast. She said, "Who do you think you are, Clark Gable?" to Leslie Howard. And, of course, they famously starred together a few years later in Gone with the Wind as Ashley and Melanie Wilkes. They were married in Gone with the Wind, but that'll be for another time.
And that will wrap up Podcast 5. We'll go on to Podcast 6. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in Podcast 6.